Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink, it is time for some Path of Exile discussion. Patch 3.21, the Chieftain was one of the least played Ascendancies. It's not that it was actually terrible, it's just that it tended to be the second, third or fourth best at pretty much everything that it did. Well, what I wanted to do today is look at the 322 overhaul of the Chieftain Ascendancy. This is not a case of a few buffs here, a couple nerfs there. The Chieftain is being thoroughly redesigned in patch 3.22 and it's not really recognisable as the same Ascendancy. It is going to have a lot less totem synergy than it used to have. It is also going to have a number of new defensive nodes that are completely different to anything else that exists in PathOfExile's Ascendancies at the moment. And it's also going to have some melee attack nodes mixed in with some fire damage over time, all sorts of weird and wonderful things here. One of the main issues that the 322 Chieftain has is a bit of a lack of cohesiveness. Quite often you can easily find 3 really good notables to spend your Ascendancy points on, but it's hard to find a 4th one. Unironically, this is probably going to make it the best way to play Righteous Fire in Ruthless. If you're interested in playing Ruthless difficulty, then the Chieftain is probably going to be very good there. But the problem with Righteous Fire Chieftain is it doesn't have a clear 4th node to pick. Normally when there's a thoroughgoing rework of an Ascendancy, if you ask people what they think on it, there tends to be a fairly strong consensus opinion that emerges. Either it's going to be great or it's going to be trash. That has definitely not been the case with the Chieftain. I asked my YouTube viewers their attitudes on it, and whilst there was a plurality who were underwhelmed by the Ascendancy overhaul, it was not a majority. And the second biggest group were people who were inspired to play a Chieftain. So the results were quite unclear, very polarised, and there's a bit of space in the middle. That's exactly where I fit. But one of the things that did come up time and time again was that 321 Chieftain builds are pretty much dead. It is going to be new things that people are playing. That said, I do think there's some good in this Ascendancy, although it might not be one of the top 10. Firstly, let's talk about the trap. Explosions in PathOfExile, they're good, right? Hinekora Death's Fury looks fantastic on a first read, then you think a little bit more about it. Enemies you kill have a 5% chance to go kaboom, dealing 500% of their maximum life as fire damage. Now, if you only think of this as the average scenario, 5% chance to explode for 500% of their maximum life is 25% on average corpse explosion damage. This would be absolutely phenomenal if it was 100% chance for 25% of their life as fire damage. This would be the best Ascendancy node in the entire game. However, 5% chance is a very, very different matter. Firstly, often that 500% maximum life is just going to end up wasted as overkill damage, but much more importantly, quite often it's just not going to go off. What I want you to do is consider 2 different scenarios. In the first one, you have a pack of 2 weak monsters and 1 strong monster. In the second scenario, you have a pack of 45 weak monsters and 1 strong monster. In the first case, when you attack those weak monsters, you're going to have a 9.75% chance for one of them to explode. Maybe both of them will, and deal devastating fire damage to the boss monster that's with them. 9.75%, intuitively you know it's not a lot. Let's compare that though to the pack of 45 monsters. Now I did pick 45 carefully, this wouldn't be the case with 46, but I think it illustrates the point and the problem with this node. When you kill those 45 weak monsters, 9.94% of the time, exactly 0 of them are going to explode, dealing their devastating damage to the boss. It is more common to get 0 explosions out of 45 monsters than it is to get 1 or more explosions out of 2 monsters. That should give you a sense as to how uncommon it is for these 5% chances to go off, and also just how unreliable they are. 500% of maximum life as fire damage is a lot, but 5% is so low that it doesn't really matter. Now, my assessment of this node, this is an F tier node in general. You should never take this unless you have an unusual application for it. Now, the situation where I would raise that up to a C tier is in some of the densest content in the game, especially dense content where there is weak monsters adjacent to very strong ones. Heist, in-map Blight events, in-map Abyss events. These are examples where Hinekora Death's Fury is okay. This will be a C tier node if you're doing a lot of that content. Now, where it does shine though, this is an S tier node in one situation, and that is Blighted Maps. Blighted and Blight Ravage maps. Especially if you can weaponize this overkill by getting 100% chance to ignite on the tree, which is not that hard to get, and then causing those 500% of maximum lives to ignite, and then to spread that out with Berserker's Respite. There is a build here, but this build is not good for general mapping. This is a build that is just good for Blight Ravage maps, and Blight Ravage maps are something that you can solve without this much investment. So really, this is a very niche situation, and I don't think Hinekora Death's Fury is good at all, although it will be hilariously fun sometimes. Now I'll talk about the obvious S tier node, and that is Valako Storm's Embrace, and its prerequisite node, Tasalio Cleansing Water. Tasalio is far better than people are giving it credit for. So, Tasalio is the weaker of the two, but it saves a lot of suffixes with or without overcapping of fire resistance. Valako is an S tier Forbidden Jewel node. This is going to be one of the best Forbidden Jewels in the game, and it's going to be very sought after by people who are playing Juggernauts, but also by people who are playing Berserkers. In fact, I think that Valako being so good on Berserkers even may actually result in an uptick in the number of people playing the Berserker Ascendancy because they've got something that gives them a powerful defense. What Valako Storm's Embrace will let you do is, for a fairly reasonable investment, get all of your maximum resistances up to 90%. Now, it is very important to note that Valako does not work with all of the leadership's prices in the game. Those of you who've run Heist a bit might be familiar with leadership's price. It's actually pretty good on builds that do a lot of fire damage, which tends to be fairly good with the Chieftain Ascendancy, and it has the text -3 to +3 to each maximum resistance individually. Now, if you get one that says +3 to maximum fire resist, -2 to maximum cold resist, and you also allocate Valako, your maximum cold resist will be affected by both a +3 and a -2, and so it will end up being +1. This is still useful, but it's not as good as if you had a +3 maximum fire resist that had no change in maximum cold resist, which will then give you 3 and 3, or if your leadership's price had +3 to maximum fire resist and also had +2 to maximum cold resist, then in that case you would keep your +3 to maximum fire resist, that would be effective, but your maximum cold resist would go up by 5. This is something I've seen misunderstood a bit because it works differently with the unique dual Melding of the Flesh. They seem superficially similar, they solve the same defensive problem in the same way, but they don't work identically. So do keep that in mind. Valako will sometimes be better, sometimes be worse than the text that is on Melding of the Flesh. If you are not intentionally overcapping your fire resistance, Tasalio is going to save you 3 to 4 gear suffixes, which is going to free up more room for things like chaos resistance, life regen, physical damage mitigation, crit mitigation, or other effects that you can get on suffixes, like some of the classic influence mods. And there are plenty of players who have a Mage Blood who spend an entire Mage Blood flask to get this sort of level of a resistance boost. If you're overcapping, Tasalio does even more. And we will come back to this topic when we start talking about one of the builds that jumps out at me as probably the frontrunner of the best thing you could play with the Chieftain Ascendancy in 322. So let's jump across to the fire damage over time node. This is the sort of thing that looks really bad against a target dummy. However, in the real PathOfExile, there are plenty of weird situations that come up where stripping away a monster's fire resistance entirely is actually really significant. And also, the Chieftain has enough tankiness from some of its other nodes, most notably the tremendous elemental resistances it'll have, that the Chieftain is reasonably able to stand stationary. Now, Ramako Sun's Light is one of those things that is niche. It's only for fire damage over time builds, and it's the only damage node for that archetype that's in the entire Ascendancy. What I want to do is compare two different approaches that you can take to stripping away a monster's resistances. Let's say that you're playing Righteous Fire or Fire Trap or something else that deals fire damage over time. Now, the way people do this in 321 is they use Wave of Conviction to strip away 15% resistance, Anomalous Flammability to strip away 39%, Indirect Scorch, say from the Maven Boots, to strip away another 10%, and this adds up to a total of 64% that you've reduced a monster's resistances by. So if the monster had 50% fire resist and you land all three of these effects, that monster is at negative 14% fire resist. Now, the way that Ramako reads, this actually means that you would do less damage when stationary with Ramako because the enemy would have no fire resistance rather than having negative 14%. However, it's important to say that if you're not using Anomalous Flammability, you can instead use Punishment, which gives 64% more damage when the monster is at low life, so 32% more damage on average. So far, Ramako is looking pretty unremarkable. However, you don't need damage on unmodified mobs very often. Where you really need damage is when a monster has unusual modifications to it that cause its resistances to be way higher than the normal. This will be when a monster has endurance charges, or it's got resistances from map mods, or it's got 160% fire resist because you tapped an Exarch altar that does exactly that. In that situation, Ramako suddenly becomes a huge damage multiplier. This and Punishment is 428% more damage than the traditional setup against monsters that have been boosted by 160% fire resist by a Searing Exarch altar. And it is 560% more damage against monsters that have had their fire resistance overcapped by the use of Expedition Remnants. And it can be even more than that if you pop multiple of those remnants. Additionally, the requirement to be stationary is something that you can easily manage. You actually won't be stationary most of the time that you're dealing damage. However, the times that you need to do heavy damage to a particular boss or a particular rare monster, you can almost always stand still safely, especially given that you can replace Wave of Conviction in your gem slots and also in your casting action time with Decoy Totem, which will achieve the safety that's needed to stay stationary. And in addition to that, you can supplement your movement with Frostblink. When using Frostblink to dodge out of the way of a monster slam, you will be considered stationary except possibly on the single frame that you move, and losing some of your damage on one frame is not a big deal. If you're going Righteous Fire Juggernaut, I think you probably don't need Valako because you're tanky enough without it. Juggernaut defenses line up really well without having the extraordinary elemental resistances. Instead, I think you might want to consider Forbidden Flesh, Forbidden Flaming in Ramako Sun's Light into your build. You'll get a significant payoff in damage that will be there when you need it most during mapping. As for heavy bossing, so fighting against bosses like the Maven or the Uber Searing Exarch, in that situation, these probably aren't as good as the traditional resist stripping mechanics. The reason for that is that those bosses tend to be quite predictable. They're dangerous, but they're unforgiving, but they're predictable. You know, if you're an experienced player that's run them a few times, when it is safe to stop still and cast Flammability, when it's safe to stop still and cast Wave of Conviction, and as a result, you don't need Ramako Sun's Light because you can strip away their resistances without it, and you can rely upon doing that. But for general mapping, and in particular for dealing with map bosses that have been augmented by altars, Ramako Sun's Light is there when you need it most to provide a damage boost that you really need. And I think this is one of those nodes that's really solid in Path of Exile, whilst being really bad in Path of Building. Next we have the melee nodes, Tukahama War's Herald, and the one that I probably can't pronounce correctly, Tawoa Forest Strength. Let's start with the latter to say that this has been changed and can't be assessed yet. The version of it that exists in the game in patch 3.21 is trash. Absolute trash. People don't use it even if they are already a chieftain playing slams. However, this is because it's got a 2-second cooldown on it and it just performs really, really badly. It doesn't work with strikes, it only works with slams. Slams are in a bad place and this is not the support that they needed. However, the new version in 3.22 is a different skill. It's still got the same name, it's still level 20, Tawo was chosen, but what it's going to do is now trigger on strikes as well. This implies that it is a completely new effect, and we need to see exactly what it does before we can judge whether it's useful or not. However, Tukahama War's Herald is something we can judge now. This is genuinely strong. If you are playing a strike build or a slam build, then this is something that you would definitely want to fit into your build. Tier-wise, I'm going to call Tawoa a question mark because we simply don't know the mechanics of how it works, and Tukahama I'm going to put as an A tier node. It provides a good amount of damage and also a good amount of screen coverage, and as a result it is a really solid thing that you probably want to have on any melee type build that is a chieftain. Okay, we've got a couple of nodes that are much worse, and these are the ones that I would say most people should not take. We'll start with Ngamahu Flames Advance. Non-unique jewels, which means rare jewels, magic jewels, and scour jewels, but in practice you'd never equip a magic jewel or a scour jewel, so this is just rare jewels. Non-unique jewels cause increases and reductions to other damage types in a large radius to be transformed to apply to fire damage. Now, I cannot find a single location on the passive tree where this truly excels, not even in conjunction with Unnatural Instinct. Unnatural Instinct could overlap with Ngamahu and work really well in theory, but there's just not enough damage types within a radius for this to be a strong combination. Snowforged is an example of a good node with Ngamahu because it will double dip. I have looked into how it worked with the old dual Fireborn, and it will double dip. You'll get the benefits of both the fire damage and the cold damage. The thing is that it's not good enough to justify giving up an Ascendancy notable and also pathing all the way to Snowforged. The Witch North area, that's also good, but it's not worth all the points and the Ascendancy node. Plus, it's also pretty hard to justify using a lot of rare jewels in the modern state of the game. Now here he's saying, what about cluster jewels? Surely the ability to transform an entire cluster jewel into a different type of cluster jewel has to be worth something, right? Well, the past precedent here is that cluster jewels don't work the way that you might intuitively think they do. Essentially, if a jewel is placed into a jewel slot that doesn't exist on the passive tree normally, but has been added to it by the use of a cluster jewel, then that jewel will have no radius effects. It will have no interaction with radius effects at all. Everything will be considered to be at infinite distance from it. This is the precedent that makes the minion jewel Fortress Covenant so solid, because nothing is deemed to be within its radius. Now, if you do desire more percentage fire damage increase nodes on your passive tree, I suggest you don't take Ngamahu's Flames Advance. What I suggest you do is you instead invest in a 12 passive fire cluster. That is going to solve your problems better than Ngamahu Flames Advance will, because Ngamahu Flames Advance is just not giving you enough. Not even when it's used at Witch North, where it turns a whole bunch of cold damage nodes and a whole bunch of lightning damage nodes into fire damage nodes. It's not like you have some massive shortage of serviceable fire damage nodes, and a fire cluster will just perform better. Now, one other thing, another past precedent here, this will not work on physical dot multiplier or cold dot multiplier nodes, because those are not increases and reductions to damage types. They instead work more like critical strike multipliers. They are a multiplier to your character's overall stats, and I don't expect that they will work together. They haven't in the past with the unique Dual Fireborn. Next, we have the node that screams at you, hey, why don't you play me with totems? The problem here is that the Chieftain has lost its identity as a totem master. Now, this node screams, play me with Righteous Fire totems. The problem here is that there's not enough support in this Ascendancy for Righteous Fire totems to make up for the enormous damage penalty that is applied to the Spell Totem support gem. The Spell Totem support gem at gem level 20 is a 40% less multiplier to the damage that the skill does, and that just ends up being an overwhelming nerf to the amount of damage. You're also giving up another support gem. That other support gem, your worst support gem, is probably 19% more fire damage and some utility. So instead of your 2-gem setup of Righteous Fire and whatever your weakest support is, raising you to 119% of base Righteous Fire damage, it's instead taking you only to 60%. This is about 48% less damage. Righteous Fire can't really cope with that, especially when you then have to invest in keeping your totems alive. That would have been dubious even before 3.16, but 3.16 had a number of changes to totems that deal damage based upon their life that ended up really hurting this playstyle even further. This was a targeted nerf at the Forbidden Right totems builds that were absolutely dominant in 3.15, but there was some splash damage, and that splash damage hit Righteous Fire totems. Additionally, it also hits the utility of this Recoup section, because totems take 80% less damage than players would from an attack. So for example, if your totem eats a slam from the regular Shaper, a player that's hit for that would be hit for about 11,000 physical damage. Instead, the totem will be hit for 2,200, and you'll recoup 220, which is not a large amount. Ultimately, this node doesn't address the damage issues Righteous Fire totems have. The recoup effects only apply to hits, and really, Chieftain just doesn't support any sort of totems well enough for this to work. Chieftain doesn't support Ancestor totems well for melee totems. It's a strong enough utility node, but it's not strong enough to justify 2 Ascendancy points. And if you want decoy totems, I suggest you just use the gem instead. Okay, so after I've rubbished a couple of the nodes in the Chieftain tree, I want to talk about a new build idea that came to me when I was brainstorming through this. And this revolves around the unique item, the Formless Flame. Now note, those of you who haven't played for a couple of leagues, the Formless Flame was overhauled in patch 3.21. You might know of this item as basically the legacy version of the Formless Inferno. Formless Inferno still exists, but the Formless Flame is the one that you want from here. This is the helm that drops from Zoth, but not in the Flawless Breachstone, it drops in the normal Breachstone. Now, the Formless Flame has the following text: 80 to 120% local increased armor, minus 30% fire resistance, minus 200 to 100 fire damage taken from hits, and then the big one, your character's entire armor score is increased by your overcapped fire resistance. Now, if you're willing to invest heavily in fire resistance on a character, the Formless Flame will turn all of that excess fire resistance into additional armor. A combination of Valako from the Chieftain Ascendancy providing excellent damage resistance against cold and lightning damage, and also the Armor and Energy Shield Mastery that provides a way to use your incredibly good armor score to partially defend against chaos damage, will enable you to use this massive armor score very effectively as an all-around defense. The only thing that you don't have extraordinarily good defenses against is physical or chaos damage over time, and those aren't generally tuned to kill you really quickly. You would use Molten Strike in conjunction with Replica Dream Feather, so that's going to put all of that extra armor to use. and you're going to use Grace, Determination, Iron Reflexes, Defiance Banner, Evasion Gear, Precise Technique, and Scale Aura Effect on Gear in order to build together a character out of these disparate parts. Your Ascendancy nodes would be the Resistance Wing and also the Melee nodes. I think there's a fairly well-rounded build idea here, but this is something that really needs to wait and see the exact details of Towoa's chosen before it's something that I'm willing to try and commit to building. Also, we need to see if there's any changes to the overall texture of the passive tree. The last couple of leagues, sometimes there's been big changes in clusters on the passive tree, sometimes there hasn't been, and that's going to have a bit of an impact into whether this is something that I think is worthwhile trying to build or not. But for the moment, this is the thing that I'm most inspired around the Chieftain Ascendancy with. I think it's something that is a uniquely Chieftain Ascendancy setup. And also, if you do take it a long way, there's a couple of good nodes that you could Forbidden Flame / Forbidden Flesh steal out of the Juggernaut Ascendancy that would have a lot of synergy with this setup. So finally, in conclusion, Physical Defier spell damage Chieftains are dead. Kaput, gone. Fire Conversion Blade Fall Blade Blast, gone. Fire Conversion Reap, gone. I don't see any reason for these skills to consider the Chieftain Ascendancy now. Instead, they don't convert to fire and they go Inquisitor, or they go a different Ascendancy entirely. Righteous Fire Chieftain is fine. I think the Juggernaut is probably likely better, but the Chieftain does have some unique strengths that the Juggernaut does not, and that's a pretty good spot for it to be in. I think if you're looking to play Righteous Fire but you're sick of Juggernaut, then it's perfectly reasonable to league start as a Chieftain. You might, however, at some point decide you just want to respec into a Juggernaut and take some of the best nodes out of the Chieftain Ascendancy instead. The Formless Flame is way better with new Tasalio than it used to be. Melee lives or dies based upon what happens with Towoa. If Towoa is good, then Chieftain Melee is going to be good. If Towoa is as bad as it was in 321, then Chieftain Melee is not going to be a build. And if it's somewhere in between, then Chieftain Melee will be somewhere in between. Note that Chieftain Melee builds do not need to be fire-themed. There is absolutely nothing wrong with Chieftain Glacial Hammer, and a Chieftain Glacial Hammer build could then use Heat Shiver. Forbidden Jewels, Leeching, Valako, or Ramako is going to be great on a lot of different builds. Ultimately though, I think my final comments on this Ascendancy are that it lacks a little bit of cohesion in its identity, mostly because Hinekora and Ngamahu are too weak to be used as damage nodes. If they had 10% more fire damage on each of them, then the Ascendancy would be quite solid, where there would be a reasonable fourth choice for a lot of different builds. Without it, this is a serviceable Ascendancy without being overly good, and I think it's going to be in a similar place power level wise to the Berserker or the Slayer in patch 3.21. There'll be people who will play it and they will like it and they will succeed with it, but a lot of the builds that are done with it could have been done on another Ascendancy at least just as well. This is not going to be a definite win of an Ascendancy overhaul like the Trickster was, but it's also not going to be a completely dead-on-arrival Ascendancy either. That's all I got on this. May your Valobs have interesting results, and I will see you around.